Um, I want to thank you, Dr. Alderman, in terms of looking at neuroscience and the advances of your colleague, Dr. Jerome Kagan, talks about nurturance versus nature, and I can see that link in strong neuroplasticity and growth, real development, real time, starting now, and not having to catch up. But the other part of the early intervention was advocated by an economist. I can't think of his name, in early childhood diversity. What a prominent economist talks about investing in early childhood education. What is that economist's name? Well, more than a few, fortunately. Maybe it's you. Heckman? Yes, Heckman. Yeah. Yes, that's so I see strong. You made the case. It's clear and convincing to me that Jerome Kagan is right. That it is the biology that we should be working on, temperance and nurturance, but I really appreciate you've confirmed it for me that we need to start now, because if we put the brakes on, there's no need to put the brakes on. Thank you.
Thanks, Harold. It was a great talk. One of the little controversial things I think you said is that the returns to investing in early childhood undernutrition are high, and the returns to investing in preventing obesity are really low. And I want to question you a little bit on that. So one of the things they often hear is that countries that are developing quickly sort of inherently take care of stunting. A country that's developing quickly, they're building toilets, they're improving healthcare, incomes are going up, diets are diversifying. Whereas that same economic development process increases obesity, right? So we have to do something to stop the inevitable increase in obesity. And as you implied, the only thing that seems to work is sort of preventing obesity in early childhood, because we know that if a child is sort of even mildly obese or overweight in childhood, they're likely to be overweight in adulthood and possibly will have overweight kids of their own. So I just wanted to question you on that.
Take a couple more. Okay.
Hi, Harold. That was a great talk. Thank you. I'm Paul Eisenman. I've been involved in nutrition and the SUN program over some pretty long time. You talked about the difficulties of placing a value on life. The Gates Foundation, at the top of its webpage, says something about we see or we place equal value on all lives. And he said, well, at least you can use cost effectiveness to see what's a more effective way of saving a life in a given situation. But it's not much help across situations, and I wonder what you think about the value of efforts to place a value to life across countries, across income groups. You can only do it by a sensitivity analysis, I suppose, but I wonder, do we have to give up on that, considering that the value of a life ought to be very important to us?
Thank you.
Thank you. Rob Bertram from USAID. Terrific lecture. Thank you so much, Harold. One of the things you said was that the kind of compelling stories about nutrition and evidence isn't often put forward to finance ministers and such. And yet an exception in that regard was Jim Kim, former president of the World Bank, who did and made a case for nutrition being an essential piece of being a 21st century economically competitive, prosperous country in a knowledge economy and so forth. All the skills you mentioned is changing. So in that regard, how do you think what you're finding here would help make the case for David Malpass to pick up that same standard and hold it high? I hear he's very keen on agriculture, but part of why agriculture's got to have a human face on it, and that's nutrition. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay, the first speaker actually wasn't asking a question, but I just would like to go into the issue because you mentioned plasticity, and that is important for the timing issues of what invention. And that's why prenatal and inventions, even preconception, should have a very high return because of great plasticity. And whether or not there is catch-up growth after the 1,000 days, and that is being debated, I think the answer to that is who cares? Because there is plasticity. I once used malleability, and a psychologist friend slapped my wrist. It's plasticity. There is plasticity for cognitive and the plasticity for certain types of socio-emotional things right through adolescence. So if there's plasticity, we're obviously going to get better investments. So I think looking at the plasticity issue is very important. To the issue of the obesity question, I don't doubt for a moment that there are great costs to the rising amounts of obesity. I just don't know what we have in our toolkits. One is to reduce low birth weight, but we already want to do that. Even if there was no obesity in the world, we'd want to reduce low birth weight. So it doesn't give us any new program design. The new steps that we're talking about, some of them are classroom, particularly in primary school. And there's some evidence of that. It was reviewed in The Lancet in 2016, I believe. But those, first of all, they're not at scale. But if they are successful, from an economic return, you don't see those returns for another 40 years. And that makes it very hard to see where your rates of return are. Issues like taxation of soda drinks or changing regulations on packaging give you a very different time frame, and may give you different rates of return. I think it's not yet the evidence on just what these programs can do, the taxation or the regulations can do, is just coming in. To be able to put them into a long-term time frame, it's going to take a little bit more modeling, but it may show you a promising way to do so. But just to repeat, the fact that it's a problem doesn't yet mean that we know what to do about the problem. And that's the puzzle. That's the priority. About saving lives, I mean, there's where case. It's very hard when you have a whole list of human rights to say, okay, if this is a right and this is a right, how do we divide our budget? Because rights are supposedly inherent and they aren't based on cost-benefit analysis. But the clearest right is saving a life. And anywhere can be done. And there I wouldn't even put it in terms of you save a life of a middle class or you save a life of a poor person. It's still saving a life. And losing a child is poverty no matter how much your money is. So anywhere you can save a life, you're more likely to be able to save a life where the risks are highest. So you still want to prioritize those areas that are high malaria, low access to food insecure areas. So you have your prioritization by where you're able to succeed in your intervention. But basically, it's a life saved is a check mark as success. That's without having to put it in dollar terms. I have not met Mr. Malpress. I don't know what his priorities. If it's agriculture, we could make the argument that there are agricultural prioritization, nutrition-sensitive agriculture, goes to diet diversity. Again, that goes to micronutrients. We can make that argument. That would not be necessarily in terms of rates of return, but it could be because, again, if it reduces anemia, if it reduces vitamin A deficiency and the healthcare costs that go with blindness, then you can make that economic argument. I just don't know where where the malleability or the plasticity is.
Thank you very much, Harold. Should we go online now? Lucy.
So this one is from Foskar from the Madibo G. Coulibaly Agricultural Advisory Services Forum in Mali. How do you factor communication and knowledge from research into the strategy to support farmers, including women farmers?
Should we take some more, Lucy? That's what we have.
Okay. Okay, it's a little bit out of my brief here. There have been a number of attempts to, as I mentioned, make agriculture more nutrition sensitive. Some of these are project level. Home gardens, diet diversity, crop diversity leading to diet diversity, improving access to markets. There is another way, a very different way, and that is improving the entire chain of marketing, all the way to the urban areas, to the manufacturers, to the ports or whatever, which can make a big difference. And research, again, our research, the CG system has been very successful in bringing up yields and bringing down costs of grains. We haven't made the same progress on fruits, vegetables, pulses yet. So that's an issue. And this is very important. One thing my colleague Derek Haiti and I have shown that in lower income countries, the cost of animal source foods and some fruits and vegetables are much higher than they are in middle and upper income countries. So you've got a double problem. They have less money to spend, and what they should be spending on costs more. So if we can find ways to, and that probably has a lot to do with what's tradable, what's marketable, what's storable. So if we can make successes, not just on the yields, but on the marketing channels, we can make the protective foods more available. But all of this is outside my topic today.
Thank you very much, Harold.
Hi, Harold. Thank you so much for the talk, and thank you so much for the message that you closed with, because I think this is something that we've really been missing amongst my colleagues at the World Bank. I'm Ann Provo, nutrition specialist at the World Bank. And I wanted to follow up on this question around what do we do next and where do we go from here, because there has been a considerable degree of success in putting this issue on the table in front of finance ministers, and a number of large investments are moving forward, regardless of which president is at the World Bank. And so I'm wondering to you, our focus has primarily been on stature and operations that are going to aim for increasing children's stature. And so what would be sort of your recommendations to countries and to teams who are now taking these operations forward? What should we be doing and what should we be measuring?
I think each country, you have one of the biggest challenges is that the responsibilities are in different ministries. Often the responsibilities for child development, early child development, there's schooling, sometimes the preschool is left off entirely, the creches, or even the home stimulation is not in the same department, the same ministry as those people responsible for vaccinations, growth, iron fortification, iron supplementation. So it depends a lot on the country of how to make it a seamless transition. You have countries like Chile, which designed that way. It's designed to be from prenatal all the way up through school as a program, but that's not by any means the norm. To try to get that integration is an administration and implementation challenge. But there are cases when, in the behavior change communication, which we're doing in many countries now, there's behavior change communication on breastfeeding, which should start in the antenatal clinic. There's on complementary feeding on weaning, which should start before 6 months so that they know what to do when they reach 6 months, and they should be age specific as the child ages. Somewhere in that age specific behavior change communication, we should start stressing not even feeding, nurturing feeding. As you feed your child, as you're breastfeeding the child, tell them a story. They're not going to understand the plot, but tell them a story anyhow, because they're going to hear the words, and you can see there's a lot of indication. Children pick up language long before they can produce language. Those type of messages can be integrated into our nutrition-specific advice relatively easy, as long as we have a age-specific set of messages, because they're different at different stages. And by 18 months, I'm picking this number, I don't have a firm scientific basis for it, somewhere we should be pivoting pretty much almost towards stimulation of various types.
Thank you very much, Harold. Don't be shy. Gentleman at the back behind.
So maybe I'm following up on a current member of the World Bank, as a retired member of the World Bank, and talking to what exactly you can do on the cognitive side now. Because I think that the power of the stunting is even in its word. It has a huge amount of, impact and galvanizing people around it. But on the cognitive side, Harold, really fantastic, and I think makes people think completely differently. How can you make that more compelling? That might sound a bit silly, because we're all very clear about the power of cognitive. But if you're putting yourself in a lower middle income country and a minister there and pushing the cognitive, they are more worried about high unemployment, huge unemployment rates. So pushing productivity when you have equilibriums in the economy that are having so much of whatever you have out there, even high cognitive skills, unemployed, poses a problem. And so I think to get to the next point, you would need to make that more compelling in the work you go forward.
Hi, Harold. This is Dan Gilligan. Two things, Harold. You just started to touch on my first question for you, which is about cognitive development and how we start to improve cognitive development early on for children. You mentioned ECD, which would be sort of a compelling approach. The Ministry of Education can handle that if we get funding behind it. But should it start earlier, and so should community-based methods be done? That would offer the opportunity to get at both determinants of stunting and cognitive development, which you mentioned is an important goal. Second, you suggested that there's a kind of an accumulation of benefits from improving cognitive development, so we can target children who are already doing well, that they can continue to benefit, and yet that suggests a kind of equity or growth trade-off, right? So because those that have been left behind maybe have both the largest capacity to respond to treatment, but also from an equity standpoint are higher priority. So how do we reconcile those two? Which do we need to prioritize over who gets those benefits? Thanks.
Unless there's pressing questions. Oh, one more, two more. And then
Thank you so much. It's a great lecture. So I had a quick question on. You discussed cost effectiveness quite a bit. So I was wondering if you have thought about targeting and generally, basically. So or has it in the recent literature has there been focus on targeting? So basically, which households, say in a rural location, are the most vulnerable, and if there's any way to make programs more effective. cost effective by targeting better? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Allison Fox, a nutrition student at Cornell. And I was wondering what types of studies you think would be needed to better build the evidence base around the pathways through which the cognitive stimulation would lead to better benefits later on.
First question from Simon. Yes, countries are considering want the employment and so forth, and to use nutrition as a way of motivating. Maybe stunting is important. Yes, not maybe. Yes, it's important for advocacy. There's no question it's important for advocacy. It's important for monitoring the basic conditions in your community. Stunting rates is a very good indicator. If the stunting rates are going down, something's going right. Conversely, if they're not going down, something's going wrong. We have to get down to exactly what that something is. So that is, from the standpoint of advocacy, of monitoring, clearly a very useful indicator. But for program design, for deciding what our priorities are, we should have a measure of what we're trying to actually achieve. If we're trying to achieve cognitive skills, then that's what we should be measuring. Maybe in addition to stunting, because eventually, and most, I would trust most ministers of finance are concerned about getting these skills for the 21st century economy. And that's not just brawn. Brawn is going down is a share of total productivity. So they are concerned. Then there's regularly a concern, do we have a skills mismatch? The skills mismatch starts very early on. We see all the time, you see various studies of 50% of all third graders can't read a sentence type of studies that come all the time from many different countries. And we say the schools have failed. Yeah, maybe. The teachers aren't there. Maybe. I'm not going to rule this out. But part of the issue is that the children start school behind. And if the teacher is teaching to the median child, they're losing those children who can't follow because their cognitive skills are already behind. And they're never going to catch up, and they'll drop out. So there's a mixture. If you want the schools to work, you need to get the preschool. And if the skills are what the minister wants, he or she should be looking back all the way to the chain, because if you're not going to get them out in the secondary, if you're getting huge dropouts because they can't follow the instructions in the first, it's a mix. Let's see. Second question. Sorry, the second question. Can you remind me? It was Dan, right? Issues of equity. I think that goes to cost effectiveness too. That is, what the best programs we have for cognitive development are skills intensive on the provider. It's much easier to give an iron fortification tablet than it is to stimulate. Now, there are programs now, some very encouraging ones coming out of India, but also some coming out of Latin America. Group-based with an occasional visit to the household, a mixture of those. They're bringing the cost down. They're still more expensive than many programs, and that's where maybe a prioritization comes in. Those people who are of higher risk of falling behind should be who you're prioritized to. If you can't do everyone, clearly you would prioritize, and that might be the communities where you're seeing greater malnutrition, using that as a easily collected indicator of where you should be focusing your broader set of programs, which include nutrition, but include more than nutrition. Because trying to set up, I mean, I've worked a lot in India, and India took 30, 40 years before they got their child development program to reach everybody, and in doing so, they're still understaffed and undertrained. To ask them to now do this for everybody of the country, would be beyond the resources they're going to have. To ask them to do it where there are higher risks in a tribal community here or in a slum here might be within their budget. That I can't be sure of, but I would hope that there can be some way of prioritizing, which gets to the question on targeting in general. Probably targeting, I would guess, at community where you deliver programs. Probably targeting individuals would be desirable. As I said, if you have a child, and some of the most promising programs, Jamaica was a very good example, they dealt with undernourished children. They were targeted in that way. There's a program now, a very successful, stunningly successful, that's just been coming out of Bangladesh, where they took underweight children and provided services to them, and a huge impact that's just been published recently. Again, they targeted undernutrition, but then they targeted undernutrition, but they didn't give them nutrition intervention. That was the indicator on that they need to have now some cognitive stimulation. So it is targeted, and it's targeted on nutrition, but it isn't a nutrition program alone. Sorry, the student asked about stunting. Can you repeat the, yeah.
Yeah, like what types of studies do you think are needed now to better build the evidence base of how we connect nutrition?
Okay, that goes to some of the things I said that Bangladesh is a good example, but in general, because the costs of these programs are so high, what we need to do is to find out ways of doing community, maybe augmented with home visits, but to ask a poorly trained person who's getting only a stipend and not a salary to make 30 visits a week or so, as some programs do, is not fair. You're not going to get anything, and it's not fair to that so-called volunteer. So if you need to do it with sufficient resources, sufficient training, you're probably going to have to find a way of being able to deliver it in a community-based approach. And then, as I said, maybe in a targeted to you get enough skills to do so.